Welcome to this revision video about the 2010 Haiti earthquake. Remember, we're using this as our primary example of a seismic event so that we can understand the causes and impacts and management of the event, as well as some of the factors contributing to the severity of the earthquake. It's worth us starting by thinking about the causes and characteristics of the Haiti earthquake. So it occurred on the 12th of January 2010 at 4:53 local time in the afternoon. Now that time itself is quite significant because actually this earthquake probably would have been even more devastating than it was had it occurred perhaps at 4:53 in the morning, when people are more likely to be inside asleep. So perhaps one of the few things going in Haiti's favour really was the timing of the earthquake. The earthquake itself measured 7 in terms of its magnitude. Remember, the moment magnitude scale is the scale that we use to measure the amount of energy released by an earthquake. Now, a 7 isn't a particularly huge earthquake. It's sizable, but we have probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 magnitude 7 earthquakes happening every year. So it's not that uncommon for magnitude 7 earthquakes to strike countries around the world. However, when we compare the earthquake in terms of its intensity, so on the modified Mercalli intensity, it was actually a 9 out of 12, so a very violent earthquake, and certainly did more damage than we would normally expect from a magnitude 7 earthquake. So it was powerful, but it wasn't extreme. What did contribute though to the severity of the earthquake, and certainly to why the shaking was quite violent, was that it was very shallow. It was only 10 kilometers in depth. So the energy released from that earthquake was being released very close to the surface, and therefore very little energy had been absorbed or dissipated by the time it reached the surface. There were also 59 recorded aftershocks, and those aftershocks tended to punch above their weight really, in so much as the initial earthquake probably did some damage to lots of buildings, which then may well have subsequently collapsed during one of those aftershocks. So even though they are smaller in magnitude, they can have a disproportionately large impact because the buildings have already been damaged by the initial earthquake. Another important factor was the location of this earthquake. The epicenter was very close to the capital, Port-au-Prince. It was only about 15 miles away from the capital. You can see in this map down here in the bottom left that the earthquake epicenter itself was here, okay, and Port-au-Prince, we can see the capital just next door to it there, only 15 miles away. So again, the energy released from the earthquake was being So again, the earthquake was releasing that energy in very close proximity to a large, densely populated city. It was also the largest earthquake to have hit Haiti since 1770. Now that's important because that's a long time ago, and that means the risk of seismic activity is not something that's going to be in the forefront of people's minds in Haiti. It's not something that they are reminded about on a daily or yearly basis. It's been a long time, over 200 years since they'd had a sizable earthquake, and therefore people are not going to be thinking about earthquakes as being an ever-present hazard. In terms of the causes of the earthquake itself, it was caused as a result of the movement of the North American plate and Caribbean plate next to one another in a conservative plate margin, or a transform or strike slip movement. So we can see here the North American plate is moving west and the Caribbean plate is moving east. Now, although the plate boundary itself runs to the north of Haiti, up here, the earthquake actually occurred on another fault line which was just further south, and it was this fault line that runs very close to the capital. The Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault was the name of the fault line that it occurred on. This links really with what we can see here in terms of a magnitude 7 is about the sort of size earthquake we would see as being maybe kind of maximum we'd expect on a conservative plate margin. We tend not to get 8s and 9s occurring on this sort of boundary because the mechanisms don't cause enough of that pressure to build up. And also the fact that the earthquake is shallow. Conservative plate margins tend to produce quite shallow earthquakes. We also need to understand the impacts that this earthquake had, and the earthquake in Haiti had numerous impacts, and certainly those impacts were very, very severe. In terms of the number of deaths, it's estimated that between 220,000 and 316,000 people died in this earthquake. Now, you'll notice that's quite a big difference between those two numbers. The UN estimating that lower figure, the Haitian government estimating that higher figure. Now, it's generally accepted that the lower figure of somewhere between 220 and 250,000 people is likely to be the more accurate figure. So if you're quoting that in an answer, you are absolutely fine to go with that more rounded figure of 250,000 people, the estimated number of deaths. Could vary for a number of reasons, but primarily down to, as we'll see a little bit later, the rapid urbanisation of Haiti. And Port-au-Prince in particular meant that accurate records weren't really kept of how many people were living in particular buildings, and took a very, very long time to clear all the rubble away and therefore recover all of the bodies. About 90% of the buildings in the capital were either damaged or destroyed, and that resulted in about 1.5 million people being left homeless. The photo that you can see here illustrates a classic example of how the buildings in Haiti were damaged or destroyed. They didn't just suffer minor damage, they suffered absolutely catastrophic collapse in an effect known as pancaking. That's what we can see an example of in this photo. So each of the stories of that building, each of the floors that we can see here, has collapsed down onto the one below it. Okay, and the building has basically stacked itself up a little bit like a stack of pancakes. That's where this name comes from. But as you can see, just from looking at the damage that you can see in this photo, that's an incredibly destructive mechanism for that building to fail. You had very, very heavy floors supported by very weak walls, and that meant that during the shaking, that building couldn't withstand the forces and collapsed. Obviously, it wasn't just people's homes that were destroyed. Around 4,000 schools were either damaged or destroyed, and that will have had knock-on impacts for the education of children in Haiti. And about a quarter of civil servants, so government and administrative workers within local and national government, were killed. That then went on to have significant impacts in terms of actually managing the hazard and governing the country in the years following the earthquake. Similar figures here relate to some of those points we've already mentioned. So about 60% of government and administrative buildings and about 80% of schools were damaged or destroyed. So that impact beyond just people's homes in the wider education system and local and national government as well. The airport and port both suffered damage. So the airport's control tower was badly damaged, and the port was also rendered unusable. And that meant it was very difficult to get aid and supplies into Haiti. So the aid was quite slow to arrive in the first few days because there simply wasn't an easy or convenient way of actually getting that aid into the country. One particular industry that was badly affected was Haiti's clothing industry. That accounts for about 2/3 of Haiti's exports, and it was estimated about 1 in 5 jobs were lost as a result of the structural damage to some of the factories. In terms of the responses and the management of the hazard, quite a large number of people, around 1 million or so, were reached in terms of provided with very, very basic shelter, so just tarpaulins that they could set up to create their own shelter. It's worth remembering though that 1.5 million people or more were made homeless by this earthquake. So even though 1 million people might have been provided with those tarpaulins, that's still leaving over 500,000 people left to fend for themselves. About 70% of the population was supported by some kind of cash or food for work project. These are often used following natural disasters because you have two situations. You have a situation where you have a lot of jobs that need to be done. You've got lots of rubble that needs to be cleared. And you've also got a large population who are out of work. So aid organisations like the Red Cross, they might set up cash for work programs whereby people are paid to do some of the essential work that needs to be done. NGOs, so non-government organisations, were also very quick to set up temporary schools and to train new teachers, and eventually water and sanitation was eventually supplied for about 1.7 million people. However, in the meantime of this happening, a severe cholera outbreak actually took hold in one of the aid camps and killed a further 10,000 people, estimated to have died from that cholera outbreak, just spread through poor sanitation and poor hygiene in the cramped living conditions in those camps. It's about 810,000 people placed in sort of formal aid camps. Again, compare that to the 1.5 million people made homeless, and we'll see quite easily that actually we're not dealing with everybody within this situation. A large proportion of Haiti's population very much left to their own devices to fend for themselves. The World Bank waived Haiti's debt repayments for 5 years, so that gave it a little bit of financial breathing space. And 6 months after the earthquake, about 98% of the rubble still hadn't been cleared, and some of it was still blocking vital access roads. A year after the earthquake, still only about 90% of it had been cleared, and 2 years after the earthquake, only about 50% of it. Non-government organisations and charities, they played a huge role in responding to the Haiti earthquake. The system of governance within Haiti was almost completely crippled by the earthquake, and therefore Haiti was very, very reliant on charities and aid organisations to be providing the medical care, the education, the food, the water and sanitation that was needed in order to keep that country functioning. If we have a look here at some of the factors that contributed to the severity of the Haiti earthquake, one of the most significant was about the poor building codes. So there were very few standards of quality that buildings had to meet. People could build buildings in any way they liked, and that's linked really with this kind of poor planning, bringing about kind of limited infrastructure, and ultimately that is also driven by this kind of poor governance. So local and national governments were not overseeing the preparation of earthquake plans. We can see here it mentions a lack of a coherent emergency plan. So that wasn't happening, and it also meant that those important standards that we would expect to see in earthquake-prone regions weren't being adhered to. Poverty was also another really important driving factor. So Haiti is and was and still is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So about 70% of the population living on less than $2 a day, living in extreme poverty, if you like. That again meant that on an individual level, people couldn't afford to prepare themselves or to manage these hazards and take the sort of steps that people in a more developed country might be able to take. As a result of that poverty as well, a large number of people were living in Port-au-Prince in slum conditions, about 86% of people living in squatter settlements. That was partly driven by this very, very rapid rural to urban migration. Lots of people were forced off farms in the countryside due to a lack of work, moved into the city, but then that led to them living in these very poorly constructed houses in quite significant levels of poverty. Good indicators of poverty, things like life expectancy was only 60 in Port-au-Prince. This is before the earthquake. The infant mortality rate about 86 per thousand, and the gross national income per capita was only $660 as well. As we've mentioned already, lots of NGOs were already providing public services. So the UN was already quite heavily involved in peacekeeping operations in Haiti. And that was partly driven by the fact that they have a very long history of unstable and ineffectual governments. Lots of coups whereby the military had overthrown the president, lots of political instability. And that, again, is what's driving this poor governance, which is driving the poverty and the rapid urbanisation and the lack of planning. People also were not that aware of what they should do. So even though Haiti is in a seismically active region, people were not necessarily aware or prepared or educated, if you like, about what they should do in an earthquake. There was a shortage of trained health workers and an underfunded health system as well. So people were already suffering, and that health system was already stretched to its absolute limit before it was then overwhelmed by this earthquake. It's worth remembering as well that Haiti is also a multi-hazard location. So it says here that it's in a hurricane belt, so it sits within the Caribbean, right in the path of hurricanes, and it had suffered quite significant losses in 2008. There were two hurricanes in 2008 that had quite a significant impact on Haiti, and then one later in 2010 as well, after the earthquake, which again contributed to the slow recovery and the slow response. So the impacts of the earthquake in Haiti were absolutely driven by poverty and poor governance. They are the two critical factors, as well as all these associated kind of knock-on effects that led to the earthquake being so severe. That was obviously amplified as well by the fact that it was a relatively shallow earthquake and it was occurring quite close to the capital city. But those two things on their own, the depth and the proximity to the capital city, don't explain all of the damage done in Haiti. A lot of it comes down to human factors of poverty and poor governance. Perhaps also worth us thinking about Haiti and how its recovery might relate to the park model. Now, you'll be familiar with this hopefully as a model which represents how countries are affected by and recover from natural disasters. So we're measuring sort of three things on this axis here: quality of life, level of economic activity, and social stability. And following any disaster, those things decline and then they get better again. And sometimes they get better than they were originally, or they return to normal. Now, if we think about how Haiti might actually compare to this model, well, initially, the first thing we might point out is that following that disaster event, that disruption is going to be very, very, very quick, very rapid. Okay, only took 30 seconds for that earthquake to start and finish. Yet it's taken over 10 years or longer for parts of Haiti to return to normal. So that disruption, very, very sudden and very, very rapid. I'd also argue that the recovery in Haiti has not been a nice smooth line like we can see here. So, for example, as things were starting to improve, we'd have had the cholera outbreak in the camps, which would have set them back a bit. Things might have been improving again, and then there's a hurricane later in 2010. So the road to recovery for Haiti is not going to be a nice smooth curve where everything is continuing to get better. You could argue as well that Haiti hasn't actually returned back to that level of normality. There are some parts of the country, particularly some parts of the capital, that haven't returned to the level that they were before the event. Some places have. So we could again think about the fact that actually for some parts of Port-au-Prince, they have recovered more quickly and the houses have been built back better and stronger. but for the country as a whole, you could argue that it's not quite reached the level that it was before. So while the park model is useful in helping us to understand generally what might happen following a natural disaster, when we try and apply it to a particular example like the Haiti earthquake, we can see that recovery is not necessarily going to fit that pattern perfectly.